Malcolm X was once asked by a white journalist what he thought of the efforts of Martin Luther King to help blacks get the right to sit anywhere on the bus. He responded, "Having an opportunity to ride on the front, back, or middle of someone else's bus doesn't dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you have dignity." Throughout his life, Malcolm exhibited a strong desire to not be a slave. Dropping out of school after being told a law career was no place for a Negro, despite doing well academically, or robbing white neighborhoods in Boston, Malcolm saw things in terms of us versus them, and always kept score. In the end, he may have lost his life to jealous rivals within his own community, encouraged by outside enemies, but he left an indelible impression on both whites and blacks in America that put him ahead of most.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time,
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. I am Hank Oslo, and I'm joined here by Hans Lander.
Hello.
Nick Mason.
Hey.
Adam Smith.
Hey, guys.
Alex Nicholson.
Hello.
And joining us again, our very special guest, Mr. James LaFond.
Hello.
And in honor of what would be approximately his 53rd anniversary of his assassination, today we're going to be talking about Malcolm X and the sort of early strain of black nationalism that he represented more generally. So Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, to a black family, obviously, with a father who was rapidly no longer in the picture, as he was supposedly harassed and possibly murdered by the Black Legion, a local white supremacist organization, on account of his own advocacy for a sort of Marcus Garvey style black separatism. The family sort of bounced around the North and the Rust Belt to Lansing, Michigan, amongst other places, until Malcolm X sort of left home and moved to Harlem at the age of 18 in 1943. He immediately established himself, if that's the right terminology, as a sort of hustler, I guess is the best term. He was definitely experienced in sort of pimping, petty theft, burglary, armed robbery. He was additionally arrested several times for homosexual activities for money in some alleyways in Harlem. He was arrested in 1946 in Boston for burglary. And after this chain of degenerate behavior, prison seemed to be the formative experience where he was first introduced to these ideas of black nationalism and black separatism in a real sense, when his brother, Reginald, who had already joined the Nation of Islam, told him about the prophet Elijah Muhammad and the good word of fighting Yaqub and all of that good stuff. He wrote to Elijah Muhammad, who sent him $5 in an envelope, which seemed to impress him. And he was at that point sort of on the Nation of Islam, the black separatist train. So I know that James LaFond, who we're very lucky to have here, he wrote a very nice sort of overview of his early life and kind of his experience as he sort of came up in this series of northern black communities. So, James, did you kind of have some thoughts on that?
Well, yes, he's like most of the black people I've known, including the men that I've known that were in the Nation of Islam. His early life was brutal. His father constantly beat his mother and the other children, and the mother paid it down. She constantly beat the children, but the brothers and sisters maintained a tough family loyalty. The way he told this to Alex Haley, you get a lot of subtext that counters what he wants you to think. There was a time when they were during the Depression, and they weren't able to collect the insurance policy on the father. Two things happened. One, there were small charities done by white people who him and his brother would hunt rabbits, and even local white folks who had plenty of their own rabbits that they hunted would still buy these off of them. And a lot of people tried to help out. And he developed his hatred for white liberals based on the welfare program, which seemed to be focused on breaking up a fatherless family. And his family was legitimately fatherless. Their father died accidentally. His father did not walk away. So they still had this idea of a unified family. And the welfare people, he constantly relates, and he even harkens back to it later in life, did everything they could to break up the family and turn the children against each other and turn them against the mother. The mother eventually went insane after she couldn't land a man. And I have to think it was three of his siblings later that converted him while he was in prison. And I have to think that although it's not explained in his autobiography, I have to think that part of his attraction to this was the extreme masculine focus and the respect for family, that this was the genius aspect of the Nation of Islam. And my experience is these are guys you can deal with. Even though they hate me, I'd rather deal with a Nation of Islam member than deal with anybody else in Baltimore City, because they have certain bedrock ethics, and you know what they are. And they seem to have done a better job of putting men and women in balance in their community than any other subset that I've run into in this country. So I think his childhood prepared him perfectly to be inducted into the Nation of Islam, and his criminal activities later in life prepared him to be a proselytizer in ghettos.
Malcolm also said that he would rather deal with a Southern bigot than a Northern hypocrite, because at least the Southerner is honest. And I think that's the masculine aspect that the Nation of Islam seems to preach, that you could relate to. And I think he definitely saw that as well.
I've heard that same thing from every older black man that I've worked with. All the solid, hardworking black dudes that are in their 50s to 90s that I know, they always prefer a Southern white man. They're almost shocked when they find out that they ran into a white guy in Maryland that they could have a conversation with and work with.
And if you look at Malcolm X's speeches, like the one sort of thing that actually seems to morally incense him is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy on the part of Northern white liberals, hypocrisy on the part of the Democratic Party, hypocrisy on the part of the Martin Luther King nonviolent faction, hypocrisy on the part of Elijah Muhammad himself after they broke. And there's a really kind of, especially when you're talking about his relationship with Elijah Muhammad, a real sense of betrayal there, that he had clearly identified him as this father figure, and then when he discovered that he was not as morally upstanding as he was led to believe, they sort of rapidly parted ways.
His hatred for hypocrisy partially seems to stem from dealing with the people at the reform school, in the school that treated him as a pet. His one chapter he titled Mascot, where he was the pet. And also has to do with a little-known portion of his life that was very formative. He didn't go straight from Michigan to New York. He spent a year in Boston with his sister, who was a very strong, positive influence in his life, and he became acquainted with a surprisingly large population of middle-class black people in Boston who would put on airs, and it really disgusted him. He was as angry with those people. It was a certain neighborhood that was named after a hill in Boston that he called these people, and they disgusted him just as much as the patrons of the various prostitution rings in New York disgusted him.
Beacon Hill?
Yes.
Yeah, that's if anyone's seen The Departed, that's where the detective, the actor's name is escaping me now, where he moves famous, it's a big scene where he's shopping for a house there. Do we want to talk at all about what the Nation of Islam is? Because it's not Sunni Islam, right? It's sort of a cult.
No.
It's about as heretical as you can get.
Yeah. They basically preach that blacks are a chosen people and that they're basically distinct from the rest of the Muslim population.
They're not just chosen, they're the original people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the Nation of Islam was formed in the 1920s by Elijah Muhammad, and it was not unique. Like, there's actually a lot of these kind of quasi-cults, quasi-new religions, especially ones that were using a lot of this Eastern imagery that were popping up around the same time in northern black areas. There's also a bunch of ones that have this kind of like black Israelites mythos, people who allege that blacks were in what's now the United States before the white man showed up, and like Egypt is in Mississippi, and all these very Baroque kind of fantasies. But their theology isn't really important. It seems to be kind of this notion of a kind of indigenous black separatist ideology that's consciously seeking to break from the kind of white European Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. It's a protest. Because I've thought that it's kind of silly. Liberals will say this too, that like, oh, Islam is I've heard liberals say this before, that Islam is it's essentially a native African religion. I mean, there are Muslims in Africa, therefore it's a native African religion. But like, I'll just make this point, like the slave trade, the Arab slave trade was staggering.
Hot and heavy started almost immediately.
Yeah, like I tried to find some numbers.
I can give you one number. A Nigerian sultan was traveling to Mecca on the Hajj, and he sold his train of slave girls in Cairo to pay his expenses. He sold 14,000 Nigerian girls in Cairo to pay his expenses.
Yeah, there you go.
One guy.
10 to 20 million Africans were sold by Muslims from like 650 AD. I mean, this is kind of a made-up number, but it's a guesstimate. So just staggering numbers, and of course they fully castrated the males.
Yeah, so that was a 90% casualty rate, that type of castration. So they needed a lot of numbers to get their sterile slaves.
Yeah, I mean, in practice, Islam functions to a large part as kind of this Arab supremacist ideology that the word of God is conveyed in Arabic, unchanged and unchanging. And if you really if you're reading a translation, you're almost definitionally a second-class adherent. Muslims don't really take American blacks seriously, to say nothing of American black Muslims.
Well, the Arab term, something like abd for blacks, it just means slave. Like Abdullah, it's the same root word. Abdullah is a slave of God. Abd is just slave. That's just how they refer to all blacks, is just slave. I suppose we do that with Slavs, but never mind. Bad point.
Well, that comes through Arabic too. Our term slave comes from the Arabic trade in Slavs. You know, their primary sex slave that they wanted was a Slavic woman.
Mm-hmm.
W.D. Fard, would you like me to mention him?
Go ahead.
He's the man that Elijah Muhammad founded his ministry on. There is an arrest record of him in L.A. from the year before. He was an Afghan. He passed himself off as a mulatto, and the cartoonish set of beliefs that he set out for the basis for this cult had more to do with the theosophy of the times. You had you even had clubs of white intellectuals involved in the theosophistic movement, which had one of its aspects was the belief that Atlantis had when it had sunk, crystals were scattered around the world. It had to do with crystal worship, people worshiping the pyramids. There was a lot of crackpot European and American made-up theology going on at the same time, and he seems to have gleaned that and somehow got a read on the position of blacks in America, and he sold this very well. He started out, I think, selling shoes or something door to door. He was selling some sort of small commodity like that, and then began preaching. And Elijah Muhammad was only one of a number of his disciples, and as soon as Fard disappears, and nobody knows what happened to him, there's not a trace of this guy. Maybe he disappeared, or maybe he was killed by somebody. But Elijah Muhammad ends up going on the run from other disciples of W.D. Fard. There was a schism before the Nation of Islam was even formed. As soon as their Afghan god disappeared, he called himself, "I am the supreme ruler of the universe." W.D. Fard said that in Detroit in 1932, and these people believed him. And they were immediately cutting each other's throats over the position as head of the priesthood when he disappeared. So the schism is built into the model.
Is there anything more American than like late 19th century, early 20th century, like weirdo cults? I don't know.
No,
well,
that's literally what America was founded on.
It came from it was Madame Blavatsky's. If anything, it was probably more popular in Europe. I mean, it had prominent intellectuals like W.B. Yeats, the poet, was a member of the Theosophical Society.
This is like an 80-year cycle that seems to happen in America with the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, the 1920s new religious movements, and then kind of the formation of these modern quasi-religious cults around various aspects of progressivism.
And Eastern fascination has always been a part of American religious life. I mean, all you have to do is look at the weird blend of essentially like Anglo-American Freemasonry in the early days with American Protestantism, and a lot of the Zoroastrian imagery, a lot of the Egypt obsession. That's always been a part of the United States. It's been a part of American outlook for at least 200 years now.
Yeah, so we can probably get a little bit more into the internal dynamics of the Nation of Islam as they become more relevant to Malcolm X in particular. But after he's arrested and spent some time in jail and writes to Elijah Muhammad, he's paroled in 1952 and actually visits Elijah Muhammad in Chicago, where he's then sent to be an assistant minister in Detroit. And if anybody has never listened to Malcolm X speak, do yourself a favor and just go on YouTube and just watch some clips, because it's immediately apparent if you listen to the guy for about 5 minutes that this guy has charisma. He is very adept at expressing himself. He doesn't really speak in the kind of kind of jive talk, or like there's not a whole bunch of like if the glove don't fit you must acquit, like rhyming.
Not bonfire of the vanities.
Exactly. He's not doing a Jesse Jackson. It's like a very articulate, white inflected, charismatic style of speaking.
He has the same accent that a lot of blacks from New York have. Like, he has the exact same accent, except that he is a huge vocabulary. Like, there's an interview he did, especially talking about white liberals, but they asked him a question and, did you say this? And they quoted him. He said, no, I didn't say that. I actually said this. And he would lay out word for word what he had said in previous statements to correct the record. Each time, you kind of had these like weird New England liberal anchors trying to pin him down on what his positions were. And he was always very clear that he wasn't going to reveal his position to you. He was always going to be as articulate as possible and being ambiguous.
Well, did you guys see my phrenology post?
Yeah.
So, the man clearly has a high amount of European admixture. I think that's a good euphemism to use.
His mother appeared to be white, and she was from the West Indies. She would work for people, and they would not know that she was so-called black because she wasn't. His mother would have been a quadroon in the old order of things, and he would have been classified as a mulatto. And he had red hair, and he was a light-skinned guy.
Yeah, he doesn't have the prognostic jaw. He has a very African nose.
His nickname was like Chicago Red at one point, or something to that effect.
Detroit Red and Red.
Yeah, Detroit Red.
And he worked in a restaurant where Red Fox worked in the kitchen, who was also a guy that had reddish hair and light skin.
James, could you talk a little bit about his life in Harlem? Because before he got arrested, he had a very interesting interaction with kind of the whites, the elites of New York, so to speak, coming up to Harlem, and also working with some of the black criminals in that neighborhood as well. And I think his identity crisis sort of started crystallizing in these interactions. If you can maybe talk about that.
Sure. At first, he brackets his experience in Harlem with the 35 riot, which he didn't experience, but where the elder black pimps and numbers men claimed that much of the prosperity in Harlem was destroyed by the Black Riot in 35 because less white money was coming in. And then the riot in the winter of 44, right before 1945, finished off Harlem, essentially almost as he was ready to go into the prison system. But his view of what it was to be black in Harlem was to be in this one-sided system of segregation where blacks had limited access to the white community, but whites had full access to the black community. And they didn't even get to run their own numbers system. That for a black guy to run numbers, he had to have a contract with some Italian or Jewish family to do that. And that was really the best money in the racket, and they could only get short-term franchises for it. All of his different criminal gigs were kind of based on what he learned immediately as a shoeshine boy, and then as a bus boy, and then as a waiter. And he wasn't exactly a pimp. He was a steerer. He was very good at saying, hey, if you're looking for a lady, here's my friend's phone number. And he had a very good friend that was a pimp. He also worked for a lesbian madam, and he would be the escort of rich, very wealthy white people who would come into town for certain sexual perversions. He told about this one lady that he would take him to, who was this gigantic, very black woman who would oil herself up and beat these rich old white men, and they loved it, and they kept on coming back for more. And so his whole experience with white people was really catering to the perversions of the rich, dealing with the utterly corrupt police force that he was dealing with, and working with Jewish merchants. Later in Detroit, when he first entered the black Muslims, and earlier in New York, dealing with tailors and jewelers and such. So his whole worldview of white people and his method of dealing with them all revolved around contact with the worst white people, the white people that we can't stand.
It should be added that it's canonical in Nation of Islam that Jews are white people.
So he's I'm very glad I read his biography, because he goes over different characters. Different criminal characters, like Jump Steady, who was the guy that would shoot up heroin or snort heroin, and then he would be a black Spider-Man. He would be out there on the rooftops doing burglaries at night, and that was his specific gig. The other thing that he says right away, and this was in Boston as well, when he talked to somebody about getting a job, they always called it a slave. This is my new slave. I'm a shoe shine boy, or whatever it is. Any job is a slave. So there's no way in the culture that he came up in, where he came of age in the black community in Boston and New York, there's no way that you could really get a legit job and maintain your masculinity. It was because you were a slave. And that way, so their outlook on the greater society is less diluted than the outlook of all these debt slaves that we live with today.
I have a kind of a question about his early life and his parents, and this kind of goes through the rest of his life in general. What was his relationship to sort of the Comintern or the Third International, or even later the early Soviet Union? Because his parents were members of Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which was sort of a quasi-socialist pan-Africanist group. But when I was trying to find any links to the Soviet Union, they kind of flip-flopped. They would either be very anti-Soviet because they regarded the Soviets as just white people, or they were trying to have the greater organization send money to the Soviet Union during World War II to fight against the Third Reich. I don't know if he had any association, or his parents did, or what his thoughts were on the Soviets.
When discussing his childhood and his father, the only association he made was that his father was a Georgia Negro, and you could tell that by speaking to him, and that he was a very large, aggressive, black, violent man, and he had a good presence. You could see where Malcolm got his presence from, and he regarded himself as working on behalf of Marcus Aurelius Garvey, who was the man who wanted to get boatloads of black Americans and take them back to Africa. And that's what he puts out there. So I have the only thing I've read on him was his own autobiography, as told to Alex Haley. So that's all he put out there in this book, was that his father preached on behalf of Marcus Garvey, but there never seems to be any connection as far as anything coming in from Marcus Garvey. It's almost like his father was a crackpot that worked as a guest preacher in various churches, did side jobs, and got a little bit of collection plate money, and was pointing people towards Marcus Garvey as a beacon of hope, but wasn't really officially part of that. That's the impression I got.
I should add, Marcus Garvey was heavily influenced by none other than Mussolini.
Really?
He mentioned
down to the uniform.
Yeah.
Well, his name comes from a Roman emperor, so not a total stretch. I was just going to say about the communist connection. I don't think Malcolm was a communist. I think he was a black nationalist. And I think the opponents of his accused him of being a communist because that was a very common thing to slander somebody with back in the day. But I don't think there was much evidence for it.
It's MLK who was the Red Negro.
Yeah, I believe that more.
He was significantly less. So in his kind of last 2 or 3 years of life, he did kind of have this black internationalist perspective that we can get into, get to there, which sort of was something that the USSR was consciously trying to cultivate. But I've never seen it alleged anywhere that he had any sort of concrete contacts with the Soviets or even with any kind of fellow traveler communists. Like most of the MLK communist connections come in through his numerous handlers, for instance, Stanley Levinson.
Yes.
And there's very few kind of actual black communists.
Well, I have a quote from him when he gave like an interview to the New York Times, and he wrote, I am not anti-American, un-American, seditious, nor subversive. I don't buy the anti-capitalist propaganda of the communists, nor do I buy the anti-communist propaganda of capitalists. I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole, whether they are capitalists, communists, or socialists. All have assets as well as liabilities.
Yeah, which, I mean, okay, like rhetorically, that's really easy to confuse with the kind of canonical third way socialist pitch. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that he was definitely absorbing some rhetoric from people who were doing kind of like the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, like he I guess he tried to work with, or he also stressed a lot of the importance of the 1955 Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Countries of the former colonial world. So these are places that refused to join up with either the West or the USSR.
So they didn't exactly refuse to join up. Like the most prominent leaders of the non-aligned movement were India, which was essentially a Soviet ally, and Cuba.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean,
and Nasser and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, like these guys were kind of Soviet puppets, but were played off the United States sometimes, so they were able to pretend to be non-aligned, I guess.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that he literally didn't live long enough to see a lot of this stuff play out.
Right.
This is a very short period of time that we're talking about, between like 1962 or so and 65, when he starts to get into this kind of international advocacy of liberation of oppressed colonial peoples, with the U.S. Negro being an example of that, which was like a common kind of meme that was floating around. But that was one that he was not around to see play out. So I don't know. It's easy in retrospect, especially when looking back at things like our Rhodesia episode, to say that, wow, like this is a disaster almost everywhere, and it ends up being fairly disastrous in the U.S. as well. But I don't know how much of that, given that period in time, you can really kind of fault him for not seeing that coming.
Well, yeah. I have a question along those lines, Hank. How exactly would you describe his political activities? Like what role?
So let's start to get into that. So he's paroled. He's sent to be an assistant minister in Detroit. Immediately, it becomes apparent that he's going to be a leader. He's collecting a following. The FBI starts monitoring him in 1957, I believe, after he becomes a prominent leader in, I believe, in Harlem at that time. Around 59 or so is when he starts actual kind of like core political, like external facing advocacy, when people start noticing this guy is giving speeches, the content of these speeches is interesting. Things kind of ramp up from there. So this notion of black nationalism is something that at this point is kind of lifted directly from the doctrine of the Nation of Islam, that you have essentially black political sovereignty, political and economic sovereignty. So the goal is to have blacks be a unified political force that uses their political capital in furtherance of their community, that controls the kind of internal economics of their community, i.e., you don't have the pattern where the evil white shopkeeper is taking all of the money from the corner store out of the community. You ideally have a black owner of that store.
Did they have a position on the? Well, I'm sure they did on Jim Crow, because in the Deep South under Jim Crow, there was effectively a black middle class that was propped up by that system. So
this is the really interesting thing. So, like, although his father was from Georgia, Malcolm X never really spent any significant time in the South, and he doesn't seem to be that familiar with kind of the structural aspects of their society down there, other than the kind of the notion of Klan riders and more racist sheriffs and all of those kind of tropes. Like the notion of a community being kind of held captive and exploited economically is, I mean, to the extent that it's a thing at all, which is debatable, that seems to be much more of a northern phenomena than a southern phenomena. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit parochial of a perspective. And he makes this point in several of his speeches. He has this phrase that he uses that the white man is more afraid of separation than integration because of the vast amount of resources that you extract from the black community, which is like, this is totally farcical, especially as far as we can see now in terms of what happens when you do actually
since the invention
have,
of the cotton gin, this really hasn't been an extraction of anything other than a burden, to be perfectly frank, having blacks around America.
Yeah, I mean, his like economic thought is extremely naive. The interesting part is his political analysis, which is extremely astute, and I think is actually extremely accurate. So the best kind of, or at least most entertaining formulation of his kind of late political thought, if you find on YouTube the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, that's kind of the canonical example. And that's a speech that happens in 1964, or at least that's when this particular recording was. I believe he gave the same kind of general speech several times. And the political analysis happens in the context of a run-up to a presidential election when you've also got the civil rights bill pending in Congress. And he makes the point that essentially blacks are held captive by the Democratic Party, which at this point is kind of a alliance between northern ethnic machines, blacks, and southern white supremacists. And that in exchange for their role as a vote bank, southern blacks in particular get essentially nothing out of this relationship. They only serve to empower a democratic regime that's a lot more concerned with keeping the southern white Democrats as part of their electoral alliance than any sort of actual concrete advancement of the black community. And so his pitch is essentially that the ballot or the bullet refers to the fact that you can either have blacks establishing local political sovereignty and using that to concretely advance their situation, which includes things like voting rights, control over their local political units, local elected offices, etc. Or you can have robust kind of post-political self-defense, and essentially, if we can't have nice things, then nobody's going to have nice things. And as far as I can tell, like that's a completely accurate characterization of the way that like blacks functioned in the democratic electoral coalition before the kind of great Southern strategy realignment under Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It's 100% spot on, and to some extent it continues being relevant because, of course, at this point they're in a similar situation where they're a 100% captive voting population of the Democratic Party that effectively receives minimal kind of real gains from it, as opposed to payoffs to their leaders.
So maybe we could talk about his sort of philosophy a little bit and what he thought blacks should be doing. I mean, he often compared the strategy of his to Martin Luther King's, as well as a lot of journalists were doing that, and he wouldn't even bring it up. But that came about quite a bit in the minds of a lot of people as to whether being activist or pacifist, if you want to use those sort of dichotomies, was the right way to go. And he basically compared pacifism, a sort of a Mahatma Gandhi style of nonviolent resistance, as something that might work in India. And I think I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said that in India they had 1,000,000-to-1 advantage over the British. And in a situation like that, when you're the elephant, you can sit on the mouse, but when you're the mouse, you can't sit on the elephant. And so in the situation in America where there were 20 million something black people against over 200 million or so white people, that just wasn't going to happen. And so he said you need to be much more aggressive. And he also contrasted the strategy of integration, segregation, and separation. So I can go into that, but do you guys want to comment?
Yeah, let's go into that.
So obviously the segregation was sort of the older system in place in much of the United States, especially in the South, where it was, the euphemism was separate but equal. So you would have people, in designated racial areas, sort of like apartheid in South Africa. And that was, especially during the Civil Rights era, considered, and even going back to the 50s with the integration, the forced integration by Eisenhower in the 1950s, of the school system to be problematic for blacks at least. And there was a lot of resistance against that from white communities. And what Malcolm ended up saying basically was that, segregation or rather integration was very hypocritical, because when and again I'm paraphrasing, but when a white man puts his arm around him voluntarily, that's brotherhood. But when somebody points a gun at the white man and tells him to put his arm around Malcolm, that's something else. It's not honest, and nobody's happy in that situation. And so rather than integration, rather than segregation, he advocated for separation, where people could be on their own feet. And both the black and white men voluntarily were able to live as they wished. And this is something that he cited Elijah Muhammad as originating in the United States.
He was an identitarian primarily after his induction into the black Muslims, and the name X that all these guys took, unless they were the leader of a temple like Yusuf Bey in Oakland, that stands for the African name that they never had, that they didn't know. And it's a revolt against having another people's identity put onto them. And this was, I don't think that he had confidence that his people, who had really been stripped of their tribal identity by a people who also stripped themselves of their own identity. I don't think he had any confidence in his people being able to maintain their identity coming from this compromised social situation. And the only way they were going to be able to build an identity was going to be to separate.
You know, I find a lot of parallels between Malcolm X, what Malcolm X said, and the famous Bluebirds Go with Bluebirds interview that Muhammad Ali did.
They were friends.
They were friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently they were friends. Do anyone want to talk about that? Is that interesting?
Well, that's the one where he talks. Yeah, he talks about miscegenation and his opposition to it.
Yeah, it's like brilliant.
Why wouldn't I want a son who looks like me? Is his kill shot in there?
Yeah, exactly. And there's another funny allusion that Malcolm actually says about Muhammad Ali, and that because he's sort of underhandedly critiquing Martin Luther King and his sort of like black spiritual sort of style of singing, getting people to do these spirituals with we can all get along kind of thing. And he said, Muhammad Ali can sing too, but he didn't get to become champion by singing. He got there by swinging, and that's basically what he advocates blacks to do.
He repeatedly discusses Christianity as a deracinating element in Black American life, that it was part of them being taken away from who they were.
And he explicitly calls out the strategy of nonviolence as being a castrating. Like, he literally uses that term, that it's a castration of the strong black man. That when you're sitting down in one of these sit downs, you're weak, you're disarmed, you're unable to defend yourself, which is it really is antithetical to the notion of a free man to put yourself in a situation where you're unable to defend yourself.
He criticized Jesus and Gandhi in the same sentence somewhere in this book. It's midpoint of the book.
What was his attitude towards Africa itself? Because he did go to Ghana at the same time. You had a lot of other black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Maya Angelou, who apparently he actually convinced Maya Angelou to return to the United States, where she lived until she died in 2014. What was his attitude towards back to Africa specifically?
I mean, I can comment on it briefly. I mean, with all due respect to his intellect, I think he was grossly misinformed as to Africa's history and, frankly, even present development in his current day. I mean, he would say things like, while Europeans were running around, in naked, bearskins, Africans were building great civilizations. I mean, he literally was like a "we was Kangs" guy. And then I think he went to Africa once, and he met probably some leaders there, and he sort of extrapolated that as being like everybody's lifestyle. I mean, this is a mistake actually white people make when they go to foreign countries and they see the cities. They don't know how the state of the entire civilization is. So I think, especially with no internet, I mean, I'm not going to be too critical, but he just didn't know, frankly, what the history was.
And his characterization of African independence movements is just 180 degrees completely off base. So he makes this claim in The Ballad of the Bullet that these African nations essentially won their independence through kind of the sole force of their own arms, which is just completely untrue. They had substantial factions within their ruling colonial countries that actively wanted to see them independent. You had, in the case of Rhodesia, for instance, you had the British government actively colluding with the black rebels to try to destroy that country. So
I think Hitler probably has more to do with African independence than anybody. bankrupting the two main
not
empires.
a stretch.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, he seemed to also not be aware of the pressure that was put on many of these countries, either by the Soviets and the Chinese, who were particularly instrumental in arming all of the rebels that took out Rhodesia. But he also didn't really seem to recognize that the United States played a huge role in pressuring decolonization. So he was blaming the U.S. for somehow upholding a colonial system, but probably the biggest proponent of anti-colonialism after World War II was the American government.
The Zionist betrayal of South Africa.
There's a really funny part in an interview with him where somebody makes the claim that Africans do not care about the plight of the American Negro, as the interviewer put it, which Malcolm X actually dismissed out of hand. He was like, no. Like, when I went there, it was clear, like, we're all on the same team.
Yeah, he believed that. So he said our successes in America evolve two circles: Black nationalism and Islam will link us spiritually to Africa, Arabia, and Asia. So he was, meeting up with the guy who ran Tanzania, and he went to Ghana, and he had ties to Nigeria, and he had ties to Nasser, and then he also had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was kind of a weird relationship that put him in a tight spot. He got tied up with the Saudi royal family, and he basically thought that if he could attain like international political support from these so-called non-aligned countries, these anti-colonial countries, he could then translate that into UN General Assembly success. Like, he thought he could get 2/3 of the UN General Assembly in some kind of global mass anti-colonial movement.
United Nations is just cringe.
I know. And he was basically trying to create Camp of the Saints against the Soviets and the United States and basically everyone north of Turkey. But unfortunately, that's really not how any of that worked.
Wait, I'm sorry, Hans. He wanted to move Negroes to Europe.
Well, it would not so much that, but sort of a massive global anti-white campaign, which is what the Camp of the Saints becomes in the late part of the novel. It's essentially
don't spoil it.
Okay, yeah.
You should
basically, he wanted to create like a global anti-white UN coalition, and traveling to the Arab countries and traveling to Africa was part of this mission of his that didn't. I mean, in actuality, it like Hank said, it was completely off base. It's not how the world really worked at all.
That his ignorance in a lot of areas is colossal, even when it came to things to do with black and white people in the United States. And you got to understand, he described himself as somebody who at one point only had a 200-word vocabulary. He had been intensely addicted to numerous drugs for his entire late adolescence. So the only real education he had was reading in prison. Mm-hmm. And he accepted the doctrine of the Nation of Islam, which was the lost found nation of Africans in America, and whites are devils. Literally, it was the blue-eyed devil white man is what he believed. Why wouldn't he try to get involved with any type of anti-white movement? The whites are the devils, and this is what these guys believe. They'll work with the devil a little bit. I've had guys who told me that before we go through with this, you know what I believe, and you know who you are. And I remember saying to the one guy, Tyrone, I said, yes, I'm the white devil, but I want you to say it with a capital T. I'm the white devil. And then we can go on with our negotiation. So they'll negotiate with the devil, but they never forget he's the devil. And he's got a very shallow appreciation of history. And none of his reading ever gets to any 20th century history. He stopped his reading pretty much. He started reading Nation of Islam literature after he got done reading Will Durant's Story of Civilization, which at that point only took you up to the Reformation, because the guy didn't finish the series until the 1970s.
Right. Yeah, but by the way, those are outstanding works of history, and they're extremely long. So Don't
Right.
completely blame Malcolm. Yeah, he and his wife.
Yeah, his wife worked on
it. Yes, Ariel Durant helped with, I think, the last 5 books, and they did a huge book on philosophy that's thousands of pages long. It's just massive. I'll give you one example of how ignorant this man was and how ignorant most people in his situation are. He thought that when people in Michigan called white boys coons, that they were insulting the white boys and accusing them of being as low as a black man. But for hundreds of years in this country, white men from Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains had called themselves coons. I have friends who call themselves coons and coon asses. The mythical mountain man, the Redford patterned the Jeremiah Johnson movie on, called himself this hair coon. So that's how ignorant he is. He doesn't even know where the coon is just based on the raccoon. It's just a sly person in the woods that'll steal stuff. That's all. And he thought it was just a
fun story. That's how Jeb Bush lost his first race for Florida governor. So the candidate that he was running against, he had this whole political campaign targeting North Florida, where he was referring to himself as the sly coon. I'm not making this up. This is real Florida weirdness hours. And there's
this is the region called the Redneck Riviera.
Yeah. There's great video of Jeb Bush being what the fuck? I don't understand what this guy is talking about, which is how he lost that election pretty handily.
Oh, that's great.
That's how he was revealed as a Yankee who was LARPing as a Floridian.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So in many ways, Malcolm X was as ignorant as any modern liberal from the Northeast, which he despised, because he was reading from the same general playbook, and he had the same shallow appreciation of the Black Muslim appreciation of American history is exactly the same as what the liberal white left thinks, that American history was built on the greatest sin ever committed on planet Earth, which was the enslavement of blacks in America as the only race that was ever enslaved.
Where you have half a million slaves ever brought over, produce a population today on the order of 40 million.
Right. At the American Revolution, you had 600,000 African slaves in America, and you had 214,000 white slaves in Pennsylvania. At that same time, it was illegal to hold a black man in bondage in Philadelphia for more than 6 months, but you could hold a white man in the state of Pennsylvania for 31 years. So this is why George Washington was exchanging his Negro servants for Rhineland servants, because he could get 3 years out of a Rhineland servant where he could only get 6 months out of a black servant in Philadelphia. And all these nuances that have been washed out of our history, they're not perceived by a man who didn't start reading until he was in his 20s. They're not perceived by him. But when you start reading American history after reading European history, and he did read the first 5 volumes of Durant's series, you know that there's something missing. You know that it's essentially a lie if you read American history after European history, because it's so sparse and there's none of the ugliness that you see, other than we're told the only ugly thing that happened in this country, black slavery. There's none of the ugliness that you see in Europe between white people. You don't see that in American history as we're taught in the 1700s and the early 1800s. Supposedly, it just happened one time in the 1860s where white people didn't get along. And so he's got a native suspicion of American history as it's been taught to him, but he also accepts a religion as dogma that's based on that same shallow American history.
And he accepts a very perverted form of that religion that really has nothing to do with the history of the United States, and has almost nothing to do with anyone that founded the United States. I mean, there's nothing you can really take from Islam and apply it to any of what happened in the early formation of the United States. So he was taking, it was like what we were saying earlier, just this weird cult version of Islam.
Yes,
and using that as historical analysis.
Yeah, and this the idea, but if you think about what stuck, that we're talking about how weird this cult of the black Muslims in America are, their strange beliefs and everything. The belief is that the black African was the original man. They don't even know that 70% of Africa for most of the past 40,000 years was owned by Capoid people who are not black Africans, okay? The last of them are the Kalahari Bushmen.
The Hadza people who have a sort of a yellow, brown
skin. They're physically more unique than any other group of people on this planet. They have an extra labial fold, and they have different hair, not like African hair, and that's where they get the Capoid name from. So they had this idea, and you think about what our main scientific anthropological subtext is in the modern world. We believe in the out of Africa Lucy theory. That's the same thing that, or at least we're told to believe that. That's the same thing that the Nation of Islam preached. Now science preaches it. Mainstream science is wedded to that we are all descended from black Africans.
Yeah, well, they moved into Africa, and the current model is that they moved, humans, early Homo sapiens, moved west into Africa, and they probably were picking up hominid ancestry that of hominids that we haven't yet sequenced or we haven't yet discovered. Because Africans are highly, divergent from the Eurasian population. But
well, both the modern scientific establishment and the Nation of Islam are interested in elevating the historical importance of the Negro.
I don't think that the modern population genetics people are. I think that they seem to be completely honest science types.
Kind of trying to keep
Cheddarman notwithstanding.
Very implicit.
Well, it gets corrupted, but there's...
West Hunter is the good blog to read on this.
Gregory Cochran's awesome.
Yeah,
everyone should read his book. Yeah.
So I have a few questions. So regarding slavery, the Nation of Islam has put out some works. We actually covered the third volume of their series, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, and that was on Leo Frank. The other two dealt with the heavy Jewish domination of the American slave trade. And so, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't draw a distinction. What they would refer to non-Jewish Gentiles, they would say white Gentiles. And I'm curious when exactly the Nation of Islam started to be aware of the Jewish problem. Do you have anything on that, Hank?
Not specifically. I mean, I know about the blood feud between Farrakhan and the kind of American Jewish community.
The ADL.
I didn't find anything on kind of Malcolm X specifically engaging with that, other than some offhand references when he's rattling off groups to Jewish liberals.
What I've heard is that Malcolm wanted what the Jews have with Israel for blacks. He wanted a homeland. That's what I've heard.
Well, so in the early 1961 and in 1962, there were meetings between George Lincoln Rockwell and the American Nazi Party and the Nation of Islam. And
which was organized by Elijah Muhammad more than Malcolm. Malcolm X actually kind of negged Rockwell.
So this is
the
there's some video. There's some video of Malcolm X actually calling out Elijah Muhammad for tactically allying with the Klan, the American Nazis, etc., and condemning him pretty strongly for that.
Yes, exactly. And from Rockwell's book, This Time the World, here's his description of the first meeting. He said that Elijah Muhammad had gathered millions of the dirty, immoral, drunken, filthy-mouthed, lazy, and repulsive people sneeringly called niggers, and inspired them to the point where they are clean, sober, honest, hardworking, dignified, dedicated, and admirable human beings in spite of their color. Muhammad knows that mixing is a Jewish fraud and leads only to aggravation of the problem that it is supposed to solve. I have talked to the Muslim leaders, and I am certain that a workable plan for the separation of the races could be effected to the satisfaction of all concerned, except the communist Jew agitators.
Yeah, this is a good point to talk about Elijah Muhammad specifically, and where him and Malcolm X start to part ways. So around 1962 to 1963, at this point, Malcolm X is a very prominent public speaker with a lot of kind of personal clout within the Nation of Islam. And he begins hearing stories of personal corruption, especially sexual corruption, knocking up a lot of female adherents, also some financial corruption on the part of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is also, at this point, not willing to cooperate in any real sense with some of the other elements of the civil rights movement, primarily things like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he's also more than willing to kind of engage in these bizarre dalliances with things like some members of the Klan, the George Lincoln Rockwell types, which, despite whatever kind of rhetorical gloss of being pro-separation, there's kind of a rhetorical intentional unclarity on whether like the separation is in Malcolm X's thinking something to be held out as a threat in the event that they're not fully integrated as equal partners into the governing system versus as kind of its own positive goal. And in any result, like, regardless of what these people say, you just honestly don't want to be associated with them. Like, as like somebody who's in the leadership of the Nation of Islam, you have enough problems without adding more variance into the mix by trying to get into bed with George Lincoln Rockwell. So
he was fairly well received, though, by the audience.
Oh, I'm sure. But I don't know that he would possibly get you anything. And he adds, now you have two task forces who are interested in you. So he begins kind of distancing himself from the Nation of Islam and specifically Elijah Muhammad. And in March 1964, he officially leaves and converts to relatively straight up Sunni Islam.
He was let go. He was informed that when he was transferred to another mosque, he built most of these congregations. He recruited far more people than Elijah Muhammad did. And Elijah Muhammad got jealous with him. And that was part of the reason for the schism. This jealousy goes all the way back to the foundation.
Oh, I would say that's 100% of the reason.
But as far as Malcolm goes, now one aspect of the Nation of Islam, there's not a lot of Islam in it. One aspect of it is this austere, almost puritanical Protestant ethic with the way you dress, the way you act, the way you speak, and the way you treat your women. And what happens is the guys that get to the top of these temples, like Yusuf Bey in Oakland and Elijah Muhammad, they began acting like Arabic Muslims and building their harems. And Malcolm was looking for some type of purity. A lot of people that get into religion after they've been involved in heavy drug addiction, their life is partially a quest for purity, and that's like the center of it. And he definitely comes across as that type. And that once he found out that Elijah Muhammad was polluted, there had to be a break in it.
I totally respect him for that, but I'm curious if he actually held up the same moral standards in his own life after he became a member of the Nation of Islam. Are you aware of any of those details, James?
No. No, I have. There's something about sex that appalled him, even when he was a steerer, and he lived like Richard Pryor did in a whole house full of hookers, black hookers, and he was dating this one white woman, Sophia, for years. He had there was a young black lady that fell in love with him, and he immediately dumped her and chose this white woman at this dance instead. And he doesn't seem to have had any interest in what a lot of guys in his situation have an interest in, which is having a lot of women. He was comfortable being the drone and to be a kept man when he was younger. And he had an unusually low sexual appetite. Where his appetite was huge was drugs. And the ability to manipulate other people. He's a manipulator and a drug user. He would be the guy that would go for the line of coke instead of the girl. And it's so I have no idea if he had anything sexually immoral going on in his personal life, but based on his autobiography comes across as very honestly spoken, because he leaves some things out, but he will contradict his text with his own subtext right in the same paragraph. He'll give you the information to let you know that he doesn't know what he's talking about while he's saying it. It's not crafted because it seems to have been spoken. There's a lot more honesty in it. And I would be surprised to find out that he did what most brothers would do in that situation.
Well, he did have 7 or 8 kids. So
he was 6'4", so he probably had plenty of female attention in addition to being a leader of a large organization.
He professed that he was horrified by this, and actually he seemed to want to live like a monk. Again, that seems to be a reaction against his criminal phase, where he's trying to be the opposite of what he was. And he chose his wife based on a couple of practical aspects. He decided that he was not his temptations were not going to end until he got married. So it seems like he got married to keep himself from being a philanderer and for failing his own standards. And her height was a great portion of the decision there. That, he wanted a woman that where there wouldn't be such an extreme. He thought that something like Wilt Chamberlain and his 5-foot-tall wife was ridiculous. He wanted to have a little bit more parity. He didn't want to stick out any more than he had to.
Talking about Elijah Muhammad and the schism there, this is a pattern that you see over and over and over and over again in every kind of out of the mainstream political movement, where you have a leadership that ends up being far more concerned with staying as the leadership of their tiny slice of the pie, as opposed to actually achieving their putative objections or growing the size of the organization or their capabilities, if that means relinquishing any of their personal control or authority.
Well, if you look at it sort of just very dryly, there's not a lot of money in extreme movements. So if somebody comes in and takes over a big chunk of whatever's left, you're not left with much either. So it's competition for resources, if nothing else.
You have currently, I'm talking about over the past 25 years, there have been numerous small cult wars between splinter groups from the Mormons. You have guys that have had gunfights over each other's wives, even down in Mexico. Different leaders of these Mormon splinter groups who will actually kill each other and then take the other guy's wives. Compared to the Nation of Islam, it seems it's almost like they act more like a black gang than they act like black Muslims when they splinter into these small patriarchal groups.
Regarding that splinter between Elijah Muhammad and X, Farrakhan obviously sided with Elijah Muhammad, even going so far as to call Malcolm X a traitor who deserved death, which I believe he admitted in an interview to Mike Wallace, I think in the 90s.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's tons of quotes from Louis Farrakhan over the years. Hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. This long thing. Was Malcolm your traitor or ours? And if we dealt with him like a nation deals with a traitor, what the hell business is it of yours? A nation has to be able to deal with traitors and cutthroats and turncoats. Like he's all but admitted to their role and the desirability of that, which is like, it's unclear to me how you can kind of as somebody who theoretically has kind of goals that are independent of the particular personality, how you can say that that's a betrayal of the organization. Like, as far as I know, Louis Farrakhan doesn't allege that these allegations about Elijah Muhammad weren't true.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Just like, don't air our dirty laundry, I guess, is the most charitable interpretation of why you would be pissed off.
One thing that was interesting after Malcolm was let go and he went on his own, the chapter in which he discusses his jaunt around Africa and the Middle East, he begins speaking like he did. He starts name dropping. He's being seduced by celebrity people left and right. And that harkens back to when he first went to New York. And he spent the whole chapter basically name dropping about all the bands he danced to and all of the cool cats that he knew. And he was using hippie terminology like Daddy-O and cats and all. And he seems to, his life seems to be a cycle of seductions and then betrayals. And it looked like he was headed into being seduced by globalist people on the left. This is what it looked like it was going. And that would point him in the opposite direction of what he had been preaching as a black Muslim.
I'd like to talk about his trip to Mecca and how that kind of changed his philosophy before he died. I know Alex kind of wanted to talk about it as well. So in 64, he went to the Middle East, and he went to Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Ghana, Morocco, and Algeria. And then when he was in Saudi Arabia, he had essentially a secondary conversion to Islam, and that he abandoned the Nation of Islam philosophy and became a full-blown Sunni Muslim, and conversed with Saudi princes and became a genuine Middle Eastern Arabic-speaking Muslim in his eyes.
So he went from being a nationalist to a globalist with that conversion.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating.
Go ahead, Hank.
Once he sort of, he's a very parochial guy. Like, we've already talked about kind of how he has this experience that's almost completely localized to these urban black northern areas. He barely has an understanding of the way that things work in concrete terms someplace like Atlanta. And now he's flying to Mecca. He's flying shortly thereafter on this kind of quasi-world tour. And you almost get the sense that, his mind is just so blown by this that he tries to kind of shoehorn it into this narrative frame of like the African as this like majestic kind of eternally soulful racial group thing that just completely ignores any concrete aspects of like, people in different places are different. Like the African American population in the U.S. is its own thing. It's completely divorced from any African experience now.
But he came of age when he became a man. It was Lindy dancing to bands in Harlem. And I'm telling you, when I read the chapter on his trip to the Middle East and Africa, he was speaking about that just like he was speaking about Lindy dancing. He was just wowed, and he was seduced. And he always wanted to be the second man. He was on his one thing that he did where he was in charge, where he formed this burglary ring with 2 black dudes and 2 white girls, and you can't figure how that would go wrong. And they got caught, and that's what landed him in prison. His only experience really with running his own thing wasn't good, and he was looking for a master. And Elijah Muhammad had let him down, so he was looking for another master. He's not cut out to be the top guy, but he has this tremendous personality that a lot of top men would want to get their hands on.
Well, he's also very young at this point. Like, he dies at the age of, I guess, doing the math here, like 40?
39.
Yeah, so, I mean, his intellectual development is not necessarily matured to the point where he's actually picked a sort of like ideology that he actually believes in as opposed to just participates in. Like, it would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to try to take over the Nation of Islam, or to have an actual schism. Be like, okay, well, we got the Nation of Islam and we got the like Islamic nationalists or whatever.
He can't be the top guy.
Yeah,
he doesn't have that personality. There's a counterpart to him in the martial arts world. I've been involved with about a dozen different martial arts schools, and you'll find that the best martial artists can't run a martial arts school, and they're constantly looking for a father figure, and that was this guy.
No, it makes total sense. I mean, if you listen to his interviews, he's extremely quick-witted, but that doesn't make for a strategist. It's basically somebody who's very, he's almost like a verbal boxer. But for somebody to sort of sit calmly, think forward, orient yourself, get rid of things that don't work mentally, I don't think he had the patience for it, frankly. I think it's not in his personality. He's much too fast-paced.
Well, speaking of strategy, I mean, what exactly is the strategy of Nation of Islam at that time and now today? I mean, Nation of Islam struggles to compete with the mainstream Black Gibbs industrial complex. I mean, it's not offering them what they want.
Yeah, they've essentially been swept aside by the whole Black Lives Matter shenanigans. They don't really matter anymore in terms of
I don't know if
politics.
I can say that much. I mean, it's basically...
There's still an indigenous power base. You can still... Like, the thing is that they don't control enough resources. They're no longer in an expansionary mode. But they still, depending on what specific area you're talking about, they can have kind of local political power.
Yeah, if you walk around Center City, Philly, any time during sort of normal business hours, you'll see loads of what I guess are American Black women wearing, I think it's called the chador. So it's the Muslim dress with the face showing. And I think they're a Nation of Islam.
In Baltimore, one of these guys is worth 50 other black dudes in any situation. And I am not of the opinion that they want numbers. Most modern people think that numbers is everything. These guys don't think that way. They actually winnow out people. I actually gave permission for one of my clerks where I managed a supermarket. I gave permission for him to try to convert coworkers, because I know having one black Muslim working for me was better than having 10 regular black dudes work for me. And we made an agreement along these lines. And I've seen 10 of them stop a riot where there's 100 guys on the other side that don't believe in anything except that they're victims. So to me, the black Muslim experiences. It's been expressed to me by the couple of martial artists that I've known and some of the guys I've worked with. It's a masculine refuge. They get to be a man. They're not with the biggest slice of black people, but they feel like they're with the best people.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think they're anti-peacocking. They're not about sort of look at me. Now, of course, you've got Farrakhan, but I think the sort of membership is more modest and humble, and I think that serves them right. And I don't think it's about just trying to get attention on, especially the white media. I mean, I think it would serve them well if they just would not care about what CNN thinks. They should do their own thing. And I think they're, as James says, I mean, they're doing right by their members.
The black Muslims I know literally do not care about black people that they don't think are cut out to be black Muslims. They'll just call them pork eaters. And I've built alliances with these guys for managing large groups of non-black Muslim black people, and you can trust them on their word, has been my experience. I trust them more than money grubbing white men, and trust them a hell of a lot more than the run-of-the-middle black Baltimorean. And I've listened to some of their recruitment spiels. There's a McDonald's where I used to drink coffee and read before I coached at a school around the corner. And this McDonald's was used by black Muslims to induct people. Actually, it's part preaching and it's part interview. They're also trying to determine if this person is worthy to join their group. They don't want any backstabbers or traitors. It's the opposite of a gang with the way they bring people in. And they have their own security organizations. There's a company that's actually in Baltimore. It's actually sanctioned under the Nation of Islam, and I worked with one of their security people before. And they're just solid people. It's like talking to white guys from my grandfather's generation when you're talking to these guys. Only they're angry. Or my grandfather was never angry about anything, but they keep the anger under control. They use it like fuel.
Yeah, right on.
So basically, when he was, I guess after coming back or starting his return from his pilgrimage to Mecca and his conversion, he abandoned a lot of his radical positions that the Nation of Islam had taught him. He wrote back, or he wrote several of these letters from abroad, one from Saudi Arabia, one from Nigeria, one from Ghana. And he wrote in 1964, America needs to understand Islam because this is the one religion that erases the race problem from its society. And then he later wrote, the white man is not inherently evil, but America's racist society influences him to act evilly. And he then later wrote, let sincere whites go and teach nonviolence to white people, which he was always against for the majority of his career, was even kind of allowing whites to interfere in this process, or to even try and talk to other white people on behalf of non-white people. So he started to see a means of, in his mind, achieving some kind of racial understanding in the United States because he had abandoned this particular dogma from the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, you see this in his later thought, I guess, where he starts to more explicitly participate in the dialectic as sort of willing counterparts to people like MLK, where he, I think at one point says something to the effect of, well, I'm glad that you're listening to him so you don't have to deal with me. Which is an interesting kind of, to set yourself up as a boogeyman. And then to make that rhetorically explicit and to ask people to not choose that as their resolution. I don't know. That's kind of a novel. You don't see a lot of people doing that.
So was he the bad cop to MLK's quotation marks good cop then?
Yeah, and
he's framed that way, but I don't know. I don't even know if that's
he's
really
framing
what he
himself
thought it
that
was.
way too. And I don't know how much they only met at one occasion in actually the gallery of I forget which House of Congress as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being discussed, and they didn't have any sort of. I don't think they exchanged more than a few words, and I consider MLK a contemptuous figure. He's a plagiarist. He's sexually immoral. He barely wrote any of the things that he is lauded for, and he seemed to serve more as an empty vessel for his handlers to project their own messages onto somebody with a sort of facile amount of personal charisma than anything else. I'm not sure if Malcolm X sort of had a high personal opinion of MLK, or if he just saw him as sort of one leader amongst many in that kind of faction of like the white liberal allied faction of nonviolent Uncle Sam, please save us from Bull Connor faction of the civil rights movement.
As a national figure, when X was killed, how did he compare to MLK? And I'm asking because I just kind of don't have a good sense of how much MLK really mattered, and how much of it is just made up propaganda since he died. I mean, he seems to have become, the system seems to have decided in the late 1980s that MLK would become a new civic saint. And now if you go into any municipal building in the country, there'll be icons to Martin Luther King. But
they elevated him to the status of Abraham Lincoln, essentially, in that like MLK became the second coming of Abraham Lincoln in sort of American civic society. And then like the late 80s and the 90s is when all the statues to him start going up. And
I suppose MLK was much more of a Southern figure, and Malcolm X was more of a Northern and Midwest figure.
Right.
I could address the issue with him setting himself up as the boogeyman willingly. That goes right back to he had a feud with a longtime friend and hustler named West Indian Archie in Harlem. He was actually glad that he got locked up. That him and Archie didn't have to go at it. They both swore that they would have to shoot each other over a misunderstanding, and he had his sense of honor was very much vested in his confidence game and the aura of steady menace. This is a guy who couldn't box, couldn't fight a lick. He only boxed twice and he got knocked out both times. But he was able to impose his will on men 2 and 3 times his age that were hardcore gangsters because he was cunning, he thought quick, and he stood up. And he had this presence in the conversation that he could use to derail a physical conflict. And he proved that he was willing to point a gun in somebody's face, some card games, and he did some stick-ups. And he needed that stature. He needed to be somebody that would be a tough character to deal with. So he would be very willing to be, just like I was very willing to be the white devil when dealing with these black Muslim characters who I couldn't have defended myself against. He's very willing to be the boogeyman when he's set loose in this political sea, because he's still got that same personality he had when he was facing down armed gangsters in Harlem, when he was just a skinny kid.
So he's looking at it as, look, if they think I'm a boogeyman, I mean, at least people are afraid of the boogeyman.
Better to be feared than loved.
Yeah, and he uses honor a lot, and speaking about things, and there's in the type of honor where he came from, fear factors in that greatly, and you can't lose that if you willingly let people become unafraid of you. The type of personality he has doesn't work as well. It's not as effective.
Yeah, and he makes a sort of a explicit point when he is attacking the Million Man March, or not the 1964 march in DC. That they're walking between the statues of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and asking the white man, to save them. And, whatever you think about that as a tactical strategy, somebody with a certain personality, to demand that somebody take pity on you, it does not comport with their sense of self.
It's what a woman does.
Exactly.
And how did it work out for the blacks? Now they've been jettisoned in favor of the not completely jettisoned, but partly jettisoned in favor of the elected new people strategy. And miscegenation affects them too, as their population's presumably been watered down a great deal more than any other group in the U.S.
Part of his aggressive personality types with his light skin tone, and even within their family there were color politics. His father, he was of the opinion that he was his father's favorite because of his light skin tone, and his very dark-skinned father kind of pitied him for that and then doted on him. And he was otherwise a brutal man. I think he was the only kid that wasn't beaten by his father. So you can't, particularly if you look at something like the French Revolution in San Domingo, Lothrop Stoddard's book, and you see the key role that mulattoes played as an actual political bloc, and the many mulattoes that began setting themselves up as community politicians, as go-betweens between the whites and the blacks during Reconstruction. You'll just see a lot of that. The miscegenation, the way it hits them with that skin tone, it puts a light-skinned guy in a do-or-die situation. He's got to project his personality and guide the situation, or he's going to get picked on and rolled over because he's a sissy light-skinned guy. So you'll see more hyper aggression and more articulation out of these guys, almost as a survival mechanism. You think of a cat on a fence with dogs on both sides. That's the kind of situation he's in racially, as a light-skinned, red-haired guy.
And that's been the same dynamic in North and South American, or just wider America's black communities since like the Haitian Revolution, and the role that mulattoes played in starting it, and then the role that mulattoes played in their own tragedy as the revolution sort of became a hunt down anyone with over 0% European DNA.
But they found a way, even in Haiti, they found a way to survive. Some of your presidents after the revolution and after they slaughtered all the white people were mulattoes all the way down to the 1920s. And you'll see them sitting at a table, these three light-skinned black guys in Haiti, and one of them's the president and his ministers, and behind them there's two white U.S. Marines. And again, even in that situation, they're playing it off. There's a book called Voodoo Fire in Haiti, written by an Austrian artist who was operating out of New York, that went on his own little safari in the 1920s in Haiti. And he talked about the color politics, that they would keep mulatto girls as special girlfriends for the elite. And there would still be some mulatto guys, even after the purge, around 1800, that would find a way in that society, but they'd have to do it in some type of either a taboo position or in a leadership position. So that they're just under intense pressure from beginning to end.
Do we want to talk about his assassination and sort of the downfall of his life in 1965?
Yeah, let's do it. So after his split with the Nation of Islam, he starts pretty immediately getting death threats from the Nation of Islam. The famous picture of him holding a M1 carbine and kind of peering out his shades, that's not him hiding from the Klan or whatever. That's him on the lookout for other Nation of Islam cadres potentially coming to burn his house down. And he's extremely aware of these threats. He makes statements at several points that he expects that there will be attempts on his life that may even be successful. So he's making a speech in, March or February of 1965. Is that in Chicago that he was in? February 21st, 1965.
He was in New York.
Harlem.
He was in New York City. Yeah, he was in Harlem.
He was in Harlem. So he's making his speech, and there's a commotion coming from the crowd. Somebody yells, "Nigger, get your hand out of my pocket!" And there's some sort of a brawl. He attempts to quell the crowd, and dude walks up with a sawed-off shotgun and shoots him. And a couple of other folks come up wielding pistols and shoot him a few more times. So he
38
suffers.
and 45.
Yeah, he suffers somewhere around 20 separate wound channels and dies on the spot. So there's not really a whole lot of debate about who precisely shot him. Obviously, the crowd collars all three of these guys, two of whom maintain their innocence, despite all evidence pointing to them as, a crowd of hundreds of people saw you walk into the stage.
You got to respect that.
Guy. There's... I guess it wasn't I did nothing.
The two pistols, the guys with the 38 and the 45, after he took the 13 buckshot that scatter round through his chest, they shot him while he was stretched out and laying down. The bullets entered his leg from below his feet, or entered his feet. So they were there to make sure he was dead. I mean, they weren't.
They were not screwing around. This was not a I just want to scare him a little bit type thing. This was wanted that guy dead. And the very public nature of the assassination, you have to see that as kind of a intentional thing. There will be no debate over who is responsible for executing this traitor from their perspective, or why he is being executed. This was like a hit commissioned by the Nation of Islam. Now, the suspicion is that because the Nation of Islam itself was so heavily infiltrated by informants, and COINTELPRO was running surveillance on them continuously, it's fairly likely, although I don't believe that there's been any conclusive proof been released, but it's extremely likely that the FBI or potentially the NYPD even was aware that this was planned, and just was happy to see this problem solved for them.
Well, the Nation of Islam has an entire page on their website they call X-Files, and it's essentially just documents, and from their point of view, the evidence supporting the theory that the FBI was directly responsible and internally might have taken credit for assassinating MLK or Malcolm X.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. They had dirt on MLK, so MLK could be controlled, and then they, what dirt could you have on Malcolm X? He's very public about his life before the Nation of Islam. So he's much more, and his message is much more dangerous, I guess. Because what did MLK want? Whatever his handlers told him to say, right?
Whatever his Jewish handlers told him to basically belt out, that was what he wanted, which was just integration in schools and kind of fulfilling the early neoliberal agenda for traditional white America.
And post 1964, after the Civil Rights Bill passes, there was a shift to, but what we really want is socialism. We want, we want high marginal tax rates. We want the U.S. out of Vietnam. We're all for nonviolence, but America is the most violent system, man.
Right, and X's own the OAAU, Organization of Afro-American Unity, and then the Muslim Mosque Incorporated group, or MMI. All of these groups were well known to have been infiltrated. It was the NYC or the NYCPD BOSS unit, BOSS. I don't know what the acronym is for, but they were the ones who infiltrated these groups in particular and worked to worked to essentially undermine them, or at least keep tabs on what their wider plans for Harlem were. And they had Gene Roberts and some of these other informants inside of these groups that gave them a lot of information. And this is where a lot of far left organization groups like Socialist Alternative, which I'm reading a lot of information from before this, and the Nation of Islam claim there's this thread of FBI involvement in him being assassinated.
It's also suspicious to me that the investigation didn't go any further than the actual trigger pullers. I mean, it looks a lot like the Patsy operations that were going on in the 60s with a lot of the assassinations. There's no further, looking into who put them up to it, who was conspiring with them. None. It's just dropped. And so that is a big question mark to me as to who else is involved. And given that the FBI is supposed to be in charge of investigating stuff like this, and they don't conduct an investigation, maybe they did, but there was nothing revealed after. It seems that makes me suspicious of them.
While we're talking about his death, there's one contrast I'd like to make between his death and his father's death that bears on the parties that are thought to be responsible. The family story he was told when he was little was that he was in his mother's belly when the KKK in hoods on horses with rifles came to the house in Omaha, Nebraska, and wanted to know where the husband was. The Earl, his father, was not home, and they did not threaten to kill him, and they didn't do anything to harm the children. They did take their rifle butts and they broke the windows, but his mother was confident that if they saw she was pregnant, they would take it easy. And she showed her pregnant belly in the door. She opened the door so they could all see that she was pregnant. And they just wanted him to leave. And the family did leave. And when he died later in a town in Michigan, it looks like he was beaten to death, and then it was staged as a suicide, as if he laid himself on the railroad tracks. So whoever did kill him seemed to be concerned about the image of him being killed. This is the complete opposite. The civility to the pregnant woman, and the embarrassment of having a black man killed in your white town in Michigan. That's a little bit different than how he went out. His father was served. His father and his father's family were served much more gently by the greater white society than he was by his slice of black society.
So, as we've gone through this conversation, it sounds to me like the Spike Lee movie actually was quite accurate.
It's not bad. It's worth
with Denzel Washington.
Correct.
I never saw it.
I think it's a pretty good movie. I enjoyed it.
It's a good movie, and
I mean,
it conveys the obviously it conveys the
angst,
the contemporary black impression of what he was about, much more than it conveys kind of what he was actually about. And it does gloss over his sort of genuine faults as opposed to the faults that he was strong enough to overcome. But I think, it works aesthetically, and it does convey like the kind of the aesthetic impact of black nationalism, if you want to call it that. It's kind of a shame, but being the myth of the 20th century, I feel like it's necessary for us to kind of end on a down note as we wind up here. As far as I can tell, Malcolm X was the last sort of indigenously derived black leader, period, that did not derive his popularity or his strength from being somebody that the white leadership class could interact with.
Yeah, Barack Obama was a system baby. I mean, he was chosen from birth, if you want to go deep into the rabbit hole, but you could clearly see the forces that were working to get him nominated, at least for the 2008 cycle. He came out of nowhere. I mean, it just was astonishing how they put him in there.
He didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of Chicago machine politics with David Axelrod and a bunch of these other freaky people.
But he had no accomplishments. I mean, for God's sakes, the guy had like one vote, in his congressional history. I mean, he did nothing. He basically, was an organizer for people complaining about stuff in Chicago.
Steve Saylor says that he was originally intended to be, I think Saylor calls him a quotation marks Muslimist, basically someone the State Department could send to the non-Arab Muslim world to be a diplomat or be a diplomat, a State Department lackey. And then it turned out that in Chicago, he had a knack for making white liberals feel good. And so he became the perfect candidate to get the white guilt vote.
Yeah, it's like, Barry, you're not quite hardcore enough to be mayor of Chicago. However, president of the United States, that's something where we mostly need somebody who can read real good.
Yeah, because like Rahm Emanuel, for all we probably hate him, like Rahm Emanuel's at the very least a very talented politician, and I'm sure that being mayor of Chicago on a day-to-day basis is probably more intricate than being the mayor or the president of the United States. President of the United States, you have an army of staffers. They can do whatever you want for you, and you just set a general agenda. But if you're mayor of Chicago, you have to participate in all these machine politics, and on top of that, you have to try and contend with these weird white liberals, a really insane black population, and a really antsy business community that's been wanting to leave for 30 years.
Yeah, no dad jeans on the opening pitch allowed.
Do you all see, I don't know too much about these Hotep guys, but do you see any parallels between Malcolm X and the Hotep guys?
Yeah.
One of the guys, his name's Ben Nadeau. I held the mitts for him before. He was an excellent boxer and kickboxer. He didn't call himself a Hotep, but he is. And I think that movement has something to do with Malcolm X because they're looking more at realistically, as far as they can, at actual African history and prehistory and what they can get out of their African heritage, as opposed to lining up with the Muslims, which once you do a little bit of reading, you find out that Islam has accounted for a whole lot of black African suffering, and that cat's out of the bag. And I think that these guys would have been black Muslims in Malcolm's day, but now they're Hoteps, and it's the same type of personality. It's a solid guy you can make a deal with. I mean, they'll believe in weird stuff that you can't fathom, and they won't budge on it. But if you agree that he's going to give you $3 for doing this, he'll give you $3 for doing this, provided you do it.
Yeah, I just want to say, in my conclusion, Malcolm's philosophy, as he matured, obviously, was, in my opinion, something that all people should strive for. And he would say things like, anytime you have to rely upon your enemy for your job, you're in bad shape. And I think that's right. You can never wait for somebody to give you a handout. You've got to do it yourself if you want to make your people, especially, go anywhere in life. And that's the masculine way to approach things, and to be a true leader, not to wait for people to give things to you.
When you say force yourselves upon others, upon the white community, how exactly do you mean that?
Well, any form of integration, forced integration, any effort to force integration upon whites is actually hypocritical. It is a form of hypocrisy involved. If a white man puts his arm around me voluntarily, that's brotherhood. But if you hold a gun on him and make him embrace me and pretend to be friendly or brotherly toward me, then that's not brotherhood, that's hypocrisy. And what America is trying to do is pass laws to force whites to pretend that they want Negroes into their schools or in their places of employment. Well, this is hypocrisy, and this makes a worse relationship between black and white, rather than if this could be brought about on a voluntary basis. So the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that what should happen is the black man himself should learn how to develop himself in the same sense that the white man has developed himself. Then they can both come together and recognize each other as equals.
Well, how can the black man develop himself as a separate society?
Well, it's easy. He's separate already. The fact that you have Harlem, the fact that you have the Negro ghetto and the so-called Negro slum, he's already separate. The fact that he's a second-class citizen is a political separation. The fact that he's the last hired and the first fired is an economic separation. Only in this form of separation, the black man is exploited. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that we should be separate, all right. But in this separate state or separate existence, the black man should be given the opportunity and the incentive to do for himself what the white man has done for himself. If you have an all-white neighborhood, you don't call it a segregated neighborhood, but you call an all-black neighborhood a segregated neighborhood. And why? Because the segregated neighborhood is the one that's controlled from the outside by others. But a separate neighborhood is a neighborhood that is independent, it's equal, it can stand on its own 2 feet, such as the white neighborhood. It's an independent, free neighborhood, free community. They're not trying to force themselves upon anyone, socially or otherwise. But the Negro neighborhood, which is inferior, is begging for a chance to integrate itself into that which is superior, which is not going to happen. It's going to cause trouble.
Well, in other words, then you think the Negro has first to raise himself to a status of equality with the white community.
Yes.
Now, what happens, assuming that he can do that? Would you then be in favor of integration, let's say, in the schools or any place else?
When you are equal with another person, the problem of integration doesn't even arise. It doesn't come up. The Chinese in this country aren't asking for integration. The Japanese aren't asking for integration. The only minority in America that's asking for integration is the so-called Negro, primarily because he is inferior, not inherently inferior, but he's economically, socially, politically inferior, and this exists because he has never tried to stand on his own 2 feet and do something for himself. He has filled the role of a beggar.
Well, how can a minority group in this country, so-called, stand on its own 2 feet?
Well, I can give you this example by explaining the difference between segregation and separation. Segregation is that which is forced upon an inferior by a superior. Separation is done voluntarily by 2 equals. If I have children and they live in my house, I care for them, they're dependent upon me, and their dependence upon me puts me in a position to regulate their lives, control their lives, tell them where to go, where they can't go. That's a form of segregation. But when those children become of age and they think they're equal with me, they leave my home. And when they leave my home and begin to set up a home for themselves, provide clothing, food, and shelter for themselves, that makes them independent of me. It puts them out of my jurisdiction. The fact that they can do for themselves that which I have done for myself makes me have to recognize that they are equals with me. And now, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that the black man in America, for the past 400 years, has been like a boy in the white man's house, begging the white man for a job, for food, clothing, and shelter. And then after the white man provides him with all of these things, he turns around and has the nerve to get angry at the white man when the white man tries to control his life.
But how, from a practical point of view, can the Negro be self-sufficient?
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad says, number one, he must have a knowledge of himself. And this gives him confidence in himself. He has been brainwashed by the educational system that exists here in America to the point where he feels he was a savage in the jungle when he was before he was brought here, and this destroys his morale. So the number one thing that has to be done, he has to be retaught, he has to be re-educated and made to know that he's a man like anyone else, and then he can stand on his own 2 feet like others have done. I might add, the whites who came here only, say 50 years ago as immigrants, have come into this country. They have set up businesses. They've developed these businesses into an industry. Some of them came here as poor immigrants, uneducated, and yet today they're economically independent. Now, the black man here was so-called free by Lincoln 100 years ago. The black man in America has a purchasing power of $20 billion. Now, and he's educated. If the white man can come here uneducated and as an immigrant and within 10 or 15 years set up an industry that provides job opportunities and educational opportunities for black people, then if the black man, the black leadership, who has access to all of this money and has all of these degrees today, can't use his talent and his know-how to set up business opportunities, job opportunities, housing opportunities for the black people, the same as the white leaders have done for white people, then these black leaders need to get off the boat. They're not leading our people toward any kind of independence, but they're using their positions and their education and their talent to exploit our people worse than the slave master did during slavery.
Are you advocating a state within a state for the Negro community?
Not a state within a state. But the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is saying that the black man, since the white man, has found it impossible to bring about integration other than on a token basis, and which proves that the two of us, the ex-slave and the master, can't live in the same house as equals. And at the same time, then what Mr. Muhammad says is they should take their navy and their merchant fleet and ship us back where they got us. And that's not deportation, that's returning stolen property to its proper owner. Now, since the government doesn't want to do that, then they have already proven that they can't bring about peaceful relations on an integrated basis in this country, give us some separate territory in this country where our people can go and do something for ourselves, and provide us with everything that we need to keep that new territory going until we are self-sufficient. And this should not be too hard to understand that the government should do it, because if this government can send $20 billion to Latin America, to some peasants who have never fought for this country or worked for this country, and is sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Africa and Asia to try and buy friendship of people who will never be friendly toward them, then they should be even more quick to spend whatever amount of money is necessary to get inside of their house straight before it's too late. So we don't think that we're begging for anything. We think we're demanding what is ours by right. And all we're asking for is an opportunity to do something for ourselves rather than to sit around as a beggar, begging for jobs and begging for education for someone else for the rest of our lives.